I'm Christian Chiller. Welcome to my podcast, an enthusiastic ramble through whatever has taken my interest the past week or so. Expect technology, games, history, travel, geekery, and as always, much, much more. Welcome to another Chinchilla Squeaks, and I am back after a little bit of a break because last week was spent doing a lot of coverage at the IBC show, and actually I'm going to be releasing a special video of that on my YouTube channel pretty quickly after this episode. Actually, I have an interview with Dotan Horovits of Logs coming up, and that was a great interview where we talked about what logs do and also open telemetry in general. First, I have an apology. Of course, I sat down to do a bunch of recording, finally getting back to the studio, and it's the day that someone decided to start drilling in a room down the hallway. So hopefully that doesn't add too much noise. These things are sent to testers and to test noise reduction software. So hopefully that is doing its job. Before we get to that interview, I do have a few small links I wanted to cover. So let's jump right into those. Firstly, something from Stephen Zechik on the Washington Post. I quite liked this. We're in the week where Ethereum have announced their merge finally, and I sort of had some very minor involvement with it years ago, and it's good to see it's finally done, or finally, I guess, in progress, and then will be done soon, and that will make some quite big changes. But this is actually an article looking at maybe a different side of the whole crypto blockchain space. And the title says it all. Crypto's massive marketing efforts have drawn few new investors. Talking about how over the past year, various very large players in the space like Coinbase, Crypto.com have spent millions of dollars on marketing to try and get people to invest, to take part, to get involved, etc., etc. And the evidence really shows that it's had extremely minimal impact on, I guess, what people like to call your mum and pop investors or your general investor. I think mostly just people who were already interested and invested in conceptually and mechanically still are, and those that weren't aren't. It didn't really change very much. Why, I guess, would be the thing to ask. No one seems to really have an answer. Actually, in typical crypto optimism, the response was, oh, well, when the major institutions roll out the various support features they have planned, then will come the adoption. And this is sort of where I personally got a little bit fed up with crypto myself, is that it seems to always be the answer. Is, oh, it's still new. Give it time. Give it time. Give it time. Give it time. But I really wonder, when do we stop giving it time and just say maybe this is a minority technology, or etc., or maybe it's not useful to the vast majority of people and the vast majority of use cases that a lot of these enthusiasts hoped. And I guess that remains to be seen. I don't know if I want to be proved wrong or not. I still have a sort of vague enthusiasm for the technology, but I don't like a lot of the realization of it. So we will see, I suppose. But it's an interesting kind of look back on whether all these efforts were actually worth it. And so far, it seems like they weren't. Next is an article from MIT Technology Review that actually got quite widely reported. This was by Melissa Heikele. There's an umlaut over that last A. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. And it is called What Does GPT-3 Know About Me? And in this, she's a Finnish journalist. This is kind of important, actually, for the article. She used GPT-3 to ask it questions about herself, and it got some basic things correct. But then the further she went down the rabbit hole, it got a lot of things incorrect and started mixing her up with other people, etc., etc. She then tried it with someone more famous, the now editor of MIT Technology Review, Matt Honan, and it came back with a lot more response. I mean, he is American. He writes exclusively in English. He is much more public. He's been around a lot longer. And I think certain parts of America have less privacy laws than Europe, so maybe there's just more information out there. But she still found, whilst it picked up some fairly salient pieces of information and some maybe concerning personal details. It depends how public Matt is about them, I guess. It still got a lot of things wrong, especially, actually, not even about his personal life, about his career. There was the famous hack article he had a while back, and it got aspects of that wrong. One could argue that maybe that's because it's an old piece of content. Who knows? So I think, and this seems to be the general trend with a lot of these GPT-3 based assistants, they are good to a point. But I guess, again, time will tell whether they get beyond that point. But in the meantime, they remain what I hope they remain in some respects, very able assistants that us humans can still use to create and flesh out and begin our work, but that we still really are the far superior creators for the most part, he says with great trepidation in his voice. On the subject of looking into the future and kind of futurism and scientific thought around topics like this was something I found quite interesting on currentaffairs.org from Darshana Narayanan about the title, again, says it all, The Dangerous Populist Science of Yuval Noah Harari. This is the author of a couple of quite famous books, Sapiens and some others as well. And I must admit, I enjoyed reading at least his first two books. I think I found the most recent one to not be so compelling, and discussing how the power of a good storyteller can make you believe things that are not necessarily lies, but not completely true, I think is the argument here. By using very good storytelling and a smattering of fact, the criticism of his work is that he makes it sound true because it's so compelling. And he uses techniques, I don't know whether consciously or subconsciously, to make you think that as a fact. And there's a few examples in this article where the author pulls upon opposing facts to show that they're not true. The interesting thing that I started reading on this, and I think it's a valid article, I don't want to criticize it in that way, that I think the interesting discussion here, and always is in this sort of field, of is the author of this article doing the same thing? And that's a good point to make. Are they doing the same thing? Are they using compelling kind of negative storytelling as opposed to his positive storytelling to give their opinion on the facts or their interpretation of the facts? And I don't know if this article had comments that dug deep into that, but that's actually, I'm just double checking. It doesn't look like it, but I found that quite an interesting thought of, you know, this always makes me think of elements of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where you have Deep Thought, who proposes that these philosophers can make a living for life out of theorizing over what Deep Thought's answer to the ultimate question will be. I don't know if that's a good comparison, but it makes me think of it in that, you know, anyone who's convincing enough can make their argument seem true. So whose argument should you believe? Well, the real answer, of course, is that you should get multiple opinions and facts and inputs on the same topic and make your own mind up. But we all know that's really not what happens. And I think this is perhaps the actual crux of this article in saying that it's dangerous to pick up books like this that have been very, very popular. And him as an author has been very, very popular and has the ears of a lot of powerful people around the world, and take them as written. And maybe that is the actual problem. Going to a complete tangent here to something very, very different. This is on Seattle Met, a strange source of content, written by Benjamin Cassidy, The Twisted Life of Clippy. I always have a little bit of a soft spot for Clippy. I had a Clippy sticker given to me by a Microsoft engineer a couple of years ago that I need to actually reclaim off my old laptop, actually. But but, is a much I don't know why I want to say it is a much maligned character. And this article actually goes into how it was created, who created it, how the people who did create it tried to hide the fact they had created it because it was so maligned for many years. And now I suppose that time is largely over, and it's kind of more amusing than embarrassing. Those people are kind of reclaiming the fact that they were involved in the process. And just how it seems, with the benefit of hindsight, how ridiculous the marketing and the production around Clippy was, and how you could think that anyone thought this was a good idea at the time, and some of the crazy things it suggested, etc., etc. But there you go. These things happen, especially in the past, especially when we were more naive with computer use. So if that interests you, go and take a read. Before we get stuck into my interview, I wanted to have another quick chat with you about Magic Mind, the drink, the shot, whatever you want to call it, that I have been trying and I mentioned last episode. I've kind of come to the end of the course now. Actually, I'm going to do a video diary. It's mostly recorded, of course, because it was a diary. I just need to add a bit more detail in my wrap-up. But I found it very useful for helping me focus on getting a lot of things done. And I've had a lot of things I've needed to get done, and the sort of energy and focus I've needed for getting those done over the past few weeks. And I'm kind of a little bit sad I've run out, actually. I also found that my sleep vastly improved. I've been having a lot of sleeping issues, and my sleep has been much better. So I sort of had that, I think I described it as a distributed energy throughout the day that I found quite useful. And then I was much more relaxed when it got to the end of the day. And I haven't really had those sleepless nights I used to experience a lot of. There's a lot of things in it, and I go into a bit more detail of them in the diary, actually. But I think the one that I wanted to mention in particular is similar to the ones I mentioned last time, but the Bacopa monnieri. It's a nootropic. The shot is full of these, which helped a lot with focus, but in this kind of balanced and less hyper-inducing method of caffeine, I guess. And I think especially when I was at the IBC show and doing a lot of physical activity, it really helped me keep that energy for quite a few days. I used to find at events I would crash after the first day after so much kind of contact with people. And that actually, I will admit, I did not really experience that this time. I didn't really crash until I got back, which was days later, probably more of a come down than a physical or mental energy. Now, it worked quite well for me. As I say, I'm quite sad that I'm now out in some respects, but if you're interested in trying it yourself, I have some discount codes for you. For the next 10 days after this recording, or this episode, you can get 40% off of a subscription at magicmind.co/chinchilla. That's CHINCHILLA. Or for a more permanent kind of one-off 20% discount, you can use the discount code at checkout, chinchilla20, spelt the same way. And I hope you have the same positive experiences I had. And now my interview with Dotan Horovits from logs.io. Enjoy.
Yeah, certainly. So first of all, thanks for having me in your podcast. Pleasure being here. My name is Dotan Horovits, and I'm the principal developer advocate at logs.io. I've been started off as a developer, and then did the solution architect, consultancy, then the product management. So quite an interesting roller coaster in my career, leading me up to the latest position as a developer advocate and technology evangelist. And as for logs.io, started off many years ago, probably the time that you met our founder, from log analytics side, primarily utilizing the best of breed open source project at the time, the Elk Stack, Elasticsearch, Kibana, for log analytics, and offering that as a managed service. And since then, we've grown to a portfolio of products in the observability space. So now we provide a whole suite of services and products in observability, but all of whom are part of the same philosophy of taking the best of breed open source stack out there and providing that as managed services, and then augmenting the open source projects with additional services, additional capabilities, and correlation between them, so that you have one holistic observability platform for cloud natives.
Yeah. So the name is possibly slightly misleading these days, but so
that's for sure. Yeah.
So to dig in, it looks like the 3, or I guess 5, effectively, open source projects that you build upon are Elk still. So I have to remember this: Elasticsearch, Logstash, Kibana, but then also more recently, I suppose, Prometheus and Jaeger. So kind of, I guess, I don't really want to use this phrase, but it's the best I can think of right now. Kind of traditional observability tools, shall we say? They weren't called that then, and then some of the kind of more modern generation of them. Would that be a fair summary, or?
I'm not sure that traditional would be the right name for
enough.
the Elk stack. I think that it's pretty vastly used, although it's no longer open source. Maybe you can talk about that later, but it's still very, very popular. So, and I think it's well adapted to the newer systems. So definitely still relevant. But definitely at any point of time, we kept evaluating, for example, with our infrastructure monitoring product. We did start off with exploring, utilizing the Elk stack, Elasticsearch for metric data, time series data as well, and seeing the trend in the market then shifting towards Prometheus as the de facto standard. Then we adapted and we provided a new release of that product that is based on Prometheus. So definitely we follow the trends as the community leads to other open source trends. For example, as open telemetry has risen, we've shifted from other types of shippers and telemetry collectors to open telemetry. So definitely the idea is at any given time to provide the support for the best of breed at present for the modern.
Yeah. Let's come to open telemetry later. We're definitely going to cover that. I know it's something you're quite... I actually watched your talk at KubeCon in Valencia.
Thank you. It was fascinating.
Yeah. So are all these offerings that you build on top of, are they unified in some way? Are they still somewhat separated from each other? Or do you kind of merge all of these into one cohesive environment that people can use to get all the benefits of each open source project, but with some sort of glue to bring a bit more magic to them?
The question is very valid, because out there, each and every one of these open source projects is a project in its own, let's say, silo, or is independent. For example, if you take Prometheus that I mentioned, and Jaeger Tracing, which is the distributed tracing open source project, they are largely independent. Although, by the way, both of which are under the umbrella of the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And if you take Elasticsearch, for instance, or OpenSearch, they are not even under the CNCF. So one of the things that we found is that these tools are very powerful and they're very popular and people choose them. But then again, many people struggle then correlating between them and getting this unified observability across the tools, across the silos, across the, these barriers. And this is part of the benefit that we've set out to resolve, to actually bring them together. We can do that only so much, obviously, because we do keep the open source as the basis. But we add a lot. For example, a one click on a trace to take you to all the logs that correspond to that trace ID is something that you would need to work very hard to do the equivalent in two independent tools. Or if you're on a metric and you want to see an exemplar trace for that metric, instead of starting copy pasting the time frame and the and other search parameters or things like that. Again, you can take that, or between the metrics and the log. So you get all the context, the search context. Imagine the incident investigation flow, the typical one. So you keep on refining the time frame and the search parameters and fields and maybe open free text searches. And then you want to take all of that and start the equivalent in And so you started off with the metrics in Prometheus, then you moved to Kibana. Copy paste is not the ideal way. So definitely things such as that, correlating alerts, and other things. Definitely part of our mission statement.
Yep. And in addition to that unified kind of ability to leverage all these projects together, what else did you add on top?
So I think that one of the things that open source projects tend to do, they tend to focus on a very clear, very focused problem, engineering problem typically, and do it very well. But then a lot of peripheral, so to speak, considerations are left unattended. It could be, for example, aspects of security related. It could be aspects of compliance. It could be aspects of collaboration, team collaboration. I want to send my snapshot of my dashboard to a colleague for him to comment or for her to comment. How do I do that? So all of these aspects, I call them the sort of the enterprise grade, the production readiness aspects beyond the core functionality. These are the sorts of things that usually are not fully attended, if any, by the open source project. So this is one layer. Another layer is an aspect of the data management. So it costs quite a bit of money to store all these, let's say, the log ingestion, and usually the cost becomes a barrier, and people need to start doing compromises on their observability to accommodate cost. So part of what we offer is the ability to manage this, to drop, for example, logs that are not interesting, to filter them out, or maybe to archive them, and then to restore them only when you need them. So you don't need to pay to hold them in a cluster, live cluster, hot cluster, but rather in a cold storage. So all sorts of cost management aspects of filtering and sampling and similar capabilities around that. And maybe the last point that I could add is around the AI and machine learning. So the ability to help beyond the capabilities that typically come from manually traversing things on the dashboard is to flush out things that appear to be anomalous, for example. So capabilities around these also.
I'd like to dig into a little bit more of what you do. Because you did quite a lot in this ecosystem, this space. So where did you come from before logs? Were you working in a similar-ish product or company or something very different, and you just like to learn very quickly?
So I've had a very interesting journey, but I guess I mentioned that I started from hands-on development for many years, primarily backend, and distributed systems and things such as that. Then I moved into product management, where I still focused on developer tools and developer platforms, like cloud orchestration, cloud management, things like that. So I always kept my passion for the technology, for the developer and DevOps persona and things like that. And then that led me, and I started doing also on the other aspect, open source things. For example, at a startup called Cloudify that does cloud orchestration. I've done a lot of things around OpenStack. I don't know if all our listeners are familiar, but back then it was the hottest thing. I'm
almost certain I've had someone from OpenStack on the podcast at some point. So.
Great. So we have a reference also to another episode here, which is great. And then setting up the OpenStack, helping setting up the OpenStack Israel community. So I started getting involved in writing and in communities and in advocating for projects and communities and things such as that. So I guess the combination of the technology domain and the passion for open source and communities has led me to, I guess, to the current role that is both developer advocacy on the one hand, and on the other hand, as I said, it's based on open source. That's what I like about logs.io, that it's based on open source projects that I truly believe are the go-to path for observability and for DevOps.
Yeah, let's go down this open path now for a little bit. So firstly, on the smaller part of the conversation, maybe, I see that in addition to integrating, and I would hope contributing back to the open source projects that you use for business, you have a couple of other small projects I can see as well. A lot of sort of integration tools with Elk, with your collector kind of NPM packages and things like that. But also I can see an interesting one here, Apollo, a CD tool for deploying on Kubernetes. What is that? I've not heard of that. And there's a lot of CD tools. So is that just one you use in-house that you decided, oh, it actually looks like it's been archived. So maybe
it's no longer open source because, as you said, back then in the day, it was very attractive for managing Kubernetes. Yeah. Today, we have many other open source tools that do that better than what we could develop in-house.
Let's ignore that one then.
But definitely, I would say one thing that you did see very rightly on our public GitHub repo is that and we have lots of repos for essentially anything that we help our users. For example, you need to fetch using Telegraph or FluentBit or FluentD from your Lambda or from your thing. We'll give you some the pre-configuration, maybe a Docker image or something like that. You can take it, by the way. You can use it for your needs. You can adapt it. It's open source, but it's just utility tools that we provide to make the lives easier for our users. That's on the integration bits that you mentioned, but we have many others. I'm actually now in the final stages of writing a blog post about a new open source that we're going to release that essentially helps people convert, when people move from InfluxDB to Prometheus, which is quite something that we see quite often among our customers at least. And they work with Grafana. Grafana is a very popular open source for the visualization for the front end. So they say, okay, Grafana knows how to work with a Prometheus data source and also from InfluxDB data source. So I want to keep my own, all of my dashboards and just migrate the dashboards from one to the other. Sounds simple, but trust me, it's hardly simple because of the different naming conventions, because of the different query language, PromQL versus InfluxQL and many other aspects. So what we wrote is an open source tool that actually is already there on GitHub. I'm now going to write something to expose it a bit more that takes the export of the dashboard based on InfluxQL and as a JSON format. It does the manipulation, the transformation, and at the output, you get a new JSON that is the equivalent dashboard in a PromQL format. So including transforming metric convention names. So it's not just the one-to-one. It's very elaborate in case naming convention changes on the metrics and many other aspects. So it's a really cool open source tool that we're going to release to the wider community. It can be used obviously as the export side could be Logs.io, but could be your local instance. It could be any Grafana supported repo and API. So these sorts of things are definitely things that we do around the open source, both our own tools and also contributing to others, like contributing to Open Telemetry and Jaeger and others.
Cool. Okay. And then the other open aspect of definitely with you, and we'll explain what Open Telemetry is, and then maybe what's your involvement with it. Because what is Open Telemetry? I think it's people who are a little bit inside this ecosystem, which I'm not entirely sure how many times I've mentioned it on the podcast. I am myself. So we're kind of talking about things we both know about, but I don't know if it really makes it out into the wider tech space that much. So what is Open Telemetry?
You're right. And by the way, I invite all of your listeners that are podcast fans apparently to also chime in on my podcast, which is squarely about open source based observability. So it's called Open Observability Talks. As the name suggests. So, and then I elaborate on many projects, including Open Telemetry there. But in a nutshell, Open Telemetry is a unified framework for generating telemetry data, logs, metrics, traces, and collecting them in a unified manner across, as I said, logs, metrics, and traces. And then exports them to whichever backend. So it doesn't have any stake in the backend. It supports formats for all the popular backends. So it's just for the generation and collection side.
Okay. And this is important because if people haven't picked up on it already, there's been lots of kind of disparate sources of information over the years. And in theory, and we always know the stereotypes and the XKCD comic about standards, but in theory, it's one standard to rule them all. But whether it will be is kind of, we'll see, I suppose. But and I think that leads nicely into, I often feel like almost every time I read something about the current status of OpenTelemetry, it's been written by you. Or spoken about by you. So what is your interest and involvement in the project? Are you an active contributor, or are you just super passionate about it and want to talk about it a lot? Like, what's your involvement?
So, first of all, I am very passionate about it. That is a very good starting point. And I'm first and foremost an evangelist of this project internally within my company to align. We started off from just taking whichever open source was there, log shipper, metric shipper, whatever, you use, as I said, FluentD or StatsD or a FluentBit or metric bit or whatever. We just said, okay, we'll help you do that. But it became impossible to manage for our users. We can handle everything, but the users need simplicity. They need the unification. And time, architectures have become more complex in that regard because you have so many data sources. Any typical architecture these days have so many third parties involved. So think about your SQL database and your NoSQL database, and think about your API gateway and your Kafka queue, or maybe cloud services equivalents for these. So whether open source or closed source or cloud services, you need to collect from so many different sources, many of whom you don't control, they're not yours. However, you need to still manage them and you need to monitor them, and you are the ultimate responsibility for the end-to-end result. So needing to keep up to speed with all this vast and growing ecosystem of third parties, in addition to the growing evolution of the programming languages themselves and their compilers and runtime environments and so on, has become just too much for one vendor to control. And I'm talking about long-standing vendors in this industry with well-established collector agents, Datadog, Dynatrace, AppDynamics. It's just too much for one vendor to hold. So this is, I guess, the thing that drove me to be passionate, because I think this is the go-to path. And to be honest, I think the signals are, although it's a young project, are that it's set out to be a de facto standard, because you really see all the major vendors, all the cloud providers, everyone is aligning behind it, and very, very active. It's today the most active project in the CNCF behind Kubernetes itself. So I'm really passionate about it, and I advocate for it internally and externally. I'm involved in certain working groups and tags. It's technical advisory groups around it, and many others.
So I saw your talk at KubeCon, and you have a follow-up blog post to this, and you've also covered it on one episode of your podcast as well. And in all of this, you've covered a lot of, and I think this is probably the most useful part of you've released recently. This, what is the current state of things? And it varies quite a bit. And I have experimented it with a little bit as well with various vendors. And it is a bit fraught. The documentation, I mean, this is something I tend to look at quite a lot, is a bit all over the place. Depending which client you're using, you get things have changed quite a lot, and you have to really dig to realize that. And so if I was to be starting a greenfield project at the moment, shall we say, do you think I should use OpenTelemetry?
I think the answer is, I'm sorry to be that, it depends.
Yeah, of course. Well, it always does.
And it really depends. It depends because it really depends on what's your tech stack and what your SLOs are, what you're trying to achieve. So as you mentioned, and I'm not sure that all the listeners know that, but OpenTelemetry is not actually one monolithic project and code base. It's in fact an aggregate, a conglomerate of many individual projects that comprise it. It's different components such as the APIs and SDKs and the specifications, and there are the OpenTelemetry collector, and then there are multiple exporters in many protocols and multiple receivers in many protocols. So it's really a conglomerate, and not all stand in the same maturity level as you mentioned. For example, at KubeCon, you mentioned my talk at KubeCon. The big news that we brought out at KubeCon Europe was in May was that metrics signal has reached a release candidate.
Yep.
It was a major milestone. So, for example, you have even in the very high level of the segmenting it by signals. Distributed tracing has been out there in general availability for over a year, and metrics has just reached a release candidate, and logs are farther behind. So definitely, my advice is to first understand your stack. You need to understand which programming languages you use, especially many organizations today are polyglot, and you have different languages in different pods. So understanding that, because as you mentioned, each programming language has its own SDK, its own client library, and they're in different maturity levels. So we need to check for your own libraries, and maybe even frameworks that you use. So you use Java with Spring, for example. So maybe there's integration built in for Spring. So that's one aspect that need to understand. Secondly, is to understand which signals you're going to collect. Traces, metrics, logs, as I mentioned, not all of them in the same maturity level, and also from which sources, because it's not just your app. You want to monitor your Kafka cluster, so you have a Kafka receiver. You want to monitor your Redis, so you use Redis receiver. So this will help you sort of understand which receivers you want to use for these signals, and then obviously to which backend you want to send it. So if you have something standard, probably you have an exporter for that protocol, but still make sure that you have the right receivers to support your backend of choice. Maybe the relevant processors if you need to do all sorts of clever aggregations and batching and filtering and other things on your telemetry. So understanding the stack, understanding what you want to achieve with your own system and your own observability needs, then start drilling into the individual statuses, as I mentioned. And it's a bit annoying. This is why I actually wrote a long-form guide, a beginner's guide to OpenTelemetry, that gives a much more simplified top-down view of OpenTelemetry that helps break down the stack and help you guide, and has links to sub-guides per programming language and per framework that can help people maybe focus more easily across. Obviously, then links to the OpenTelemetry.io, which is the main site of OpenTelemetry, but it helps focusing. Otherwise, people tend to get lost with all the, as you said, different documentations and different statuses.
And I think I also got lost because sometimes different vendors will sort of highlight it, but then their documentation is also out of date, and so you get kind of. Yeah, anyway.
And many of them, it's important to say for our listeners that many vendors actually today offer distros of OpenTelemetry.
Yes,
so they take the vanilla OpenTelemetry and then package it, add their own respective receivers, exporters, processors. We, for example, at Logs.io have that. Many other vendors do. So you need to also check that the distro that you get from your vendor is the latest. And if not, make sure that you don't read the vanilla one that is in a more advanced version than the distro that you're using by your vendor.
So it's going to be an interesting next few years, I think. But
according to, by the way, Gartner on its last hype cycle just came out a few weeks ago. Actually, started covering OpenTelemetry, putting it on the hype cycle in the starting of the hype cycle, but expecting it to be, according to Gartner, in the achieving the plateau level of that within 2 to 5 years, which is, by the way, very good. If Gartner says that, then I'm not optimistic in what I used to say.
And also, to be fair, a lot of people pay to be in Gartner reports, and if it's an open source project, they didn't. So you can actually you can actually trust it.
That's a good point there.
So, all right, just to wrap up, I think we could have talked about a lot of different topics, but we're actually having this chat because you are attending Container Days. I attended last year. I'm actually registered to attend this year, but I have to go somewhere else and I can't fit it in. So we would have had a conversation there. But what are you going to Container Days for in the fantastic old port of Hamburg? It's actually a really cool venue. So
I'm really excited to be flying over to Hamburg, and I'm going to actually deliver 2 talks. One is going to be a lightning talk, a short one about OpenTelemetry, which is going to be interesting. So if you are passionate about this topic and what we chatted about, and the second one, the full talk, is going to be about cracking performance issues in your microservice architecture using distributed tracing.
Okay.
So if distributed tracing is something you'd like to explore, definitely join this one. And if I may also mention, the week after that, I'm going to be at the Open Source Summit in EMEA in Dublin. Going to be talking about open source and the dark side of open source, maybe some of the topics we talked about earlier on.
Ooh.
So another interesting upcoming
maybe
talk.
Maybe I should see if I could register for that. That sounds that sounds interesting. I think I saw that coming out on the newsletters and completely forgot to look at it. September is already kind of busy, so maybe I just ignored everything else. But it actually sounds very interesting, and this has been a topic that's come up a lot recently. And I have spoken. We've had various guests on the show talking about aspects of this, but it's a big conversation in open source at the moment, and has been for some time, but especially at the moment. So that's actually a really interesting subject. I will try and find the talk, even if I don't see it in person.
Maybe we can add it to the show notes on this program.
For sure. And just to clarify, in case anyone has been confused, it logs with a Z, so logs.io. And you're very active on the website. On the front page, you can see your face very quickly and find what you've been working on. So if anyone wants to find more of your work, it's there.
And I'm also Horovits, Horovits, on basically everywhere. So Medium, Twitter, LinkedIn, Quora, wherever. It's plain and simple. My last name, my surname, and you can follow me. I'd be glad to follow up on any interesting topic that came up.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
That was my interview with Dotan of logs.io. I hope you found that interesting. I did. He's always a good speaker. Check out his podcast as well. And updates from me. Not too many right now. I am actually on the verge of finally, I don't know how much I've talked about it, switching to part-time work. So from next week. So I'm going to be producing and finishing a lot of my projects. And where I have been a little quiet on some things because I've been busy kind of wrapping things up, there's going to be a lot coming out very, very soon. But in the meantime, just after this, I'll be releasing my coverage from IBC, which was a great experience. Actually, it was really good to get back to a big conference like that and meet people and get connections, advice. I worked with a film crew from officehours.global as well, and that was a great experience. But head over to my YouTube channel to find that video and get more of that. Until next time, when I think I will have a lot more updates for you, thank you very much for joining me. Take care, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the show. Find out more about me at chrischinchilla.com, where you can find show notes, sign up for my newsletter, and find all of my writing, games, work, and video links. There's also details on how to get in touch with me. And if you want to get even closer to what I do, join my Discord server for behind-the-scenes discussions and helping me produce my shows and work.